Kurt Campbell is doing. I think he's really one of the great thinkers, and really appreciate his service. And I can assure you from my travels, he's very well respected around the region. So I'm a great fan of Kurt Campbell.
Well, we all are, and we're also great fans of you, Senator. And I don't have to introduce Senator McCain, obviously. I think that when the term, one of America's leading statesmen, I don't think there's anybody who knows more about all parts of the world than Senator McCain. I'm always afraid to talk to him about any subject because I know that he knows more than I do about any subject that we're going to talk about. But so it's a great pleasure to have you here again at the Foreign Policy Initiative Forum. All day we've been talking about defense with some people that you may know. Maybe you've heard of Senator Lindsey Graham. And
hey, do not believe anything that Senator Graham says. I want to tell you, some people allege that he's my illegitimate son, and so did you have an interpreter?
We're going to. People did have to crane in a little bit, but no, but we're also going to give you a chance to set the record straight now. Well, obviously, one of the top issues right now is the defense budget, and we did talk to Senator Graham and also Senator Ayotte about that a little bit, but I just wanted to get your sense of where things are, where things are heading. Are we going to find some way of dealing with the issue of sequestration? Maybe you'd like to start by filling us in on that.
I just mentioned, because I heard the last question, and before I jump into that, I applaud the administration's efforts to spend a lot of our effort and attention on the Asia-Pacific region. I think that the President's agreement with Australia could be a precursor to arrangements with other countries in the region. A joint operating base where you don't have to build the hospital, the school, the family housing, but you go in, you have joint operations, you go to another place. I think that's the model for the future. I think that if the Chinese continue to act such as they did day before yesterday with the collision or the problem with the Korean-Chinese incident there, that you're going to see a lot more willingness of countries in the region, such as Philippines, Vietnam. Let me just mention that a ship named after my father and grandfather that's based out of Japan paid a port visit to Da Nang not long ago, which shows if you live long enough, most anything can happen in this world. But I do want to say we do have to devote our attention. I do not envision conflict, confrontation, etc. with China. But the best way to ensure that that doesn't happen is to have a robust presence, a very serious alliances and agreements, not a NATO. We will never reach a NATO, but we certainly could reach a sort of a alliance situation where we work and operate together, particularly in the ocean, since the South China Sea is the focal point for a lot of this contention between China and its neighbors, which then brings me to your question, and that is spending. If that's the track we're on, the shift of attention as we draw down or out of Iraq and or draw down in Afghanistan, and we shift our focus to the Asia-Pacific region, which we should, that means it's going to be very expensive, because what do you need in those vast expansions? You need air and naval capability. And when a aircraft carrier costs $5 billion, with a, by the way, $500 million cost overrun, and a F-35 costs whatever the latest outrageous number is, $79 million, depending on, the first $1 trillion weapon system in history, then we're going to have to make some very tough choices. And we're going to have to educate our voters that money spent on defense is well spent and very important. So what's going to happen? Lindsey and I and John Kyle and Kelly Ayotte and Saxby Chambliss and a lot of us, and Joe Lieberman I know will join. We're trying to come up with an alternative to the $600 billion sequestration that could be in the offing. Now, I'm sure you know that it's not supposed to take place till 2013. Well, the Pentagon is planning right now for 2013, so it's not something that we can wait. We had a meeting with Secretary Panetta last week. He urged us to, if we are going to act as soon as possible, because they are required to make certain plans in consonance with what is the law that's been passed. I think we can come up with a viable way of at least dramatically reducing the sequester. And don't forget, the sequester has got to be thought of in the terms of we're already required to cut spending by some $480 billion over the next 10 years before we get into sequestration. $20 billion less this year. So, and finally, postscript, and I'm sorry for the long answer, but it's very, very important, because what we do will have a direct impact, obviously, in my view, on our national security. We have to convince the American people that their dollars are well spent, and that means we've got to stop these cost overruns, which have become astronomical. I asked Ash Carter in his hearing for going from acquisition to Deputy Secretary of Defense, I said, is there a culture of corruption in the Defense Department? He said yes. He said yes. We have these cost-plus contracts that there's research, and then there's the development side. Research, you can understand a cost-plus contract. Once you've decided on whatever the weapon system is, to continue with cost-plus contracts is insane. We have seen, since the 1990s, a consolidation of defense industries and a lack of regulation of those industries. So there's not the kind of competition there used to be, and there's no brakes on what they charge the federal government. I was reading a thing the other day, yesterday, the Future Combat System. Everybody remember the Future Combat System was the future of the Army, how they were going to equip themselves, etc. They wasted $300 billion. $300 billion. That is not acceptable to the people in my state who are worried about the fact that the food banks in Phoenix and Tucson aren't going to have enough food for this holiday season to care for the people who are unemployed. So if I sound passionate about it, it's because I am. Because I believe that this nation faces more challenges than any time in our history, at least since the end of the Cold War, and we are spending money on defense that we simply cannot afford to do. We cannot afford to do business as usual in the Pentagon.
Well, let me ask you, picking up on that, Senator. I mean, there might be people who will come back and say, well, look, if the Pentagon wasted $300 billion on the Future Combat System, why can't we squeeze another $600 billion out from the sequestration merely out of more bad programs that they're spending too much money on?
I think that's an excellent point, and I think we can squeeze a lot of money out. But what sequestration does, as you know, I think they've accepted personnel costs is across the board. That would affect both good and bad. So I think we can save a lot more money in defense spending, and that $460 billion is not chump change that's already being enacted and planned on. So it's the kind of cuts that I strongly disagree with, because there are a lot of, if those cuts were implemented, I think that it would hit certain aspects of defense, including the acquisition of and maintenance, operations and maintenance of weapons systems that could put us in some threat.
Well, looking out back at Asia, since you came in after Kurt and you mentioned what he was talking about, I mean, what do we need out there in that theater that we don't currently have? Where should we be putting our emphasis in terms of our defense budget dollars?
I don't want to bore you, but there's a base realignment that needs to be done to get some of our forces out of Okinawa. Our relationship with Japan is very strong, but there's also a strong feeling in Okinawa that the Marines, they live too close proximity. There have been incidents that always happen when you have a foreign troops stationed in a country. So we need to realign. We need to move some of our troops to Guam. We need to do a number of things. But we've been working with Kurt Campbell and Carl Levin and I and others, and we put a pause on this whole realignment until we get an overall study of what we can do in the region. Again, this comes down to cost. The original cost of our base realignment, that's moving some of the Marines out of Okinawa into other places and building a new base, was going to cost $6 billion. You know what the cost is now, and they haven't turned a shovel? $16 billion. We can't afford to do that. And so we're going to have a study, and what I would envision would come out of it is kind of a joint operating base concept in the region along the lines of what we just did with Australia. So we're going to need air power, we're going to need sea power. And if the focal point or the area of tension is the South China Sea, it's going to be very important that we have those capabilities. Some of you have seen the Chinese Minister of Defense who drew the dashed line in the South China Sea, and that's their, quote, economic zone. I mean, that is in violation of every principle that we have ever fought for in our history. Freedom of navigation of the seas. And it's clear, that just not to insult your intelligence, that the Chinese believe that the last 200 years was an aberration of history, not part of history. But I also ask the question then, if they're so smart and they're so wise, why in the hell do they continue to prop up North Korea?
Do you feel that you're getting the kind of support you need in terms of trying to address this defense budget and sequestration issue from the administration, from the White House and elsewhere?
You know, it's a fascinating kind of scenario because there's been no more articulate voice about the devastating effects of sequestration than the Secretary of Defense. I mean, he's spoken out in the most compelling fashion, and yet the President still says that he will veto legislation which neuters that. So it's an interesting kind of juxtaposition between the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. You know, I like to blame everything on the President now. I'll probably do that today, but the fact is, this was an act of Congress. This was not the President of the United States. This was the deal made in return for the formation of the super committee. So I don't blame the President on this particular issue. I blame those in Congress that decided that we would have such draconian option without fully appreciating, I think, the fact that there's such gridlock now in Washington that a super committee was not going to bridge those gaps. I never thought it would from the beginning.
Well, turning to the Middle East for a bit, given that we've seen the victory of Islamist parties, Muslim Brotherhood, and also the Salafists in Egypt, we've got an Islamist party in strong position in Tunisia. I think the general consensus is everywhere you're going to have an election in that part of the world these days, you're probably going to get some variation of that. Does this make you question whether we should be supporting democratic change in this region?
No. I think you can look at it at both the good and the bad here that's going on in the Arab world. I believe that a lot of us anticipated that the road to democracy is a very rough one. We saw that in the countries, the difficulties that they experienced for a decade or so, what was the former Soviet Union, and certainly there was a level of history, at least some, that those countries had, which made it somewhat easier than we would expect in the Arab world. In Tunisia, they just elected a government. They just formed a government for the first time. Is it an Islamic government? Yeah. Is Israel a Zionist government? I'm excited. I'm exhilarated by what happened in Tunisia. Libya, I still think it's going to be very difficult, but I have some confidence that they will move forward successfully. Morocco, they have orchestrated some. The king has orchestrated some changes which have generally satisfied most of the people. In Jordan, we are seeing Abdullah make some changes, which again, it's a very difficult situation and always was even before the Arab Spring there. But coming to Egypt, first of all, we all know that what happens in Egypt is the crucial. That's where it all matters. That's the heart of the Arab world. I'm disappointed, obviously, in some of the things that have taken place. I do not believe that the Muslim Brotherhood is monolithic. They were the only opposition for a long time, and there are divisions within the Muslim Brotherhood itself. The Salafists bother me a great deal. I've been somewhat disappointed in the military because I think it's clear that they're doing everything they can to maintain their unique position in Egyptian economy and society. But I also think that some of these things they can muddle through. And I do not believe that Mubarak could have lasted forever. I don't believe that Ben Ali could have lasted forever. I don't believe that Gaddafi could last forever. I do not believe that Bashar Assad is going to last forever. And as I tweeted the other morning, I said, "Dear Vlad, the Arab Spring is coming to a neighborhood near you." So I believe that the Arab Spring is going to spread everywhere. I think it's going to spread to China. I think it's going to, in some kind of respects, now maybe this is a stretch to some of you, but I think the Tea Partiers and the occupiers in some way are a little bit of a manifestation of this dissatisfaction. Look, I think that the occupiers they're outrageous when they prevent other people from exercising their liberties, but at the same time, there's great discontent in American society as well today. So I guess in summary, I remain guardedly optimistic. This change was coming, and it was inevitable, and so therefore we got to manage it as best we can. And by the way, I forgot to mention, I still think, and I've said for a long time, the Saudis are riding a tiger. They can't stay on, and they can't get off. And so there's a lot more to come, I think, in that part of the world than we've seen yet. I think it might be the beginning, or not even the middle.
I want to turn to Russia in a second, but just one last thought on Egypt. You know, if the military sometimes is trying to pose a choice for us between supporting them or supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and letting the Muslim Brotherhood have what it wants, that choice may actually come to a head when the question comes of who's going to oversee the writing of a constitution. I think the new parliament's going to assert its right to do that as an elected body. I think the military has already at least toyed with asserting that it's the only safe organization that can do that. Where should the United States come out on that issue?
I think that in Tunisia, the military did not play a role in their path towards elections and forming a government. I know it's a very delicate situation, but I think we have to make it clear to the Egyptian military that for them to stifle in any meaningful way the path towards democracy can only lead to radicalization in Egyptian society, and then we would have the worst outcome in the long run. We're not very popular in Egypt right now. One of the reasons is because the Egyptians on the street believe we came very late to the party. Now, whether we should have or not, I'll be glad to debate that. But the reality on the street in Egypt is that we were very, very late to providing them with the kind of moral support that they felt that they needed. And I'm not talking about any other kind. So I think it's very risky, and I think there's a lot of things that can happen, but let me just mention, there's so many things, but one aspect of this, the reason why I'm a little bit optimistic. If Bashar goes, that is a huge blow to Iran, it's a huge blow to Hezbollah, it's a huge blow to Hamas, even though they may be of different, either Sunni or Shia. It is a horrendous blow to the forces of evil that I believe were dominating Lebanon, were posing a direct threat to Israel. And I don't know what's going to happen when Bashar goes. I've believed for a long time he was going to go. But it can't, I don't see a likely scenario that it's worse than Bashar Assad.
What do you say, speaking of Israel, what do you say to Israelis who say, look, democracy is all well and good, but what we've got is a transition in every one of these countries from a relatively friendly government to a potentially hostile government. Why has that been good for us?
Because one of the reasons is Mubarak used to keep the peace, but he would stoke the Israeli sentiment within Egypt vigorously all the time, as an old tactic of dictators. And there is a chance, I would believe, over a long period of time, where a freely elected democratic state finds common ground with another freely elected democratic state, which was not going to, I think, ever be the case as long as Mubarak in power. Now, I'll admit to all of you, I may be digging for the pony here, but I also, though, think that our moral support, our assistance, not dictation, but assistance, and our involvement in as many ways as possible with them, I think is a fairly important ingredient in seeing the progress that we want to see. And I've met with Sintawi, and I've met with a lot of the other military leaders. As you know, they come every year. They're leading military. I always meet with them every year. But I also told them a long time ago that they couldn't keep doing what they were doing. And so I guess we'll see. We live in interesting times.
Well, it's also interesting in Moscow and in other cities in Russia these days. And, you know, given what you've just said about our, you know, providing moral support in terms of the Arab Spring, what about our policy toward Russia? Now, the administration obviously has conducted a reset policy, and they'd point out the gains that they've gotten from it. The agreement on Iran sanctions bill last year, resolution last year, the northern transport route into Afghanistan, other areas of cooperation. But given what's going on in, I mean, are those things of no value now that we should focus mostly on what's going on internally in Russia, and if so, why?
I think that particularly the northern route is important. I think that the START treaty, which they have now, you know, well, one of the reasons why we had such a debate on the new START treaty was because of the Russian addition to the signing agreement that any missile defense systems that they view as a threat was reason for withdrawal. And obviously those who were pushing for the ratification were saying, "Oh, ignore that, they really don't mean it," etc. Well, their comments lately indicate that it's very likely they're more serious than at least the advocates of the New START treaty characterized it. Putin, I guess it was about 6 years ago, said, "I have two big problems. One is Chechnya and the other is McCain." So I think that, you know, and he probably was a little aggravated when I said I looked into his eyes and I saw three letters, a K, a G, and a B. But that I think that this is a corrupt system. This is a corrupt kind of a oligarchy. You know, the Magnitsky case is a classic example of this kind of lawlessness. Khodorkovsky, I was not a huge fan of Khodorkovsky, but if you read the statement that he read after he was sentenced again, where he said, "I know I'm going to die, but I would rather die for the principles and freedom of the Russian people." This is a kleptocracy, whatever you want to call it. Certainly not really a representative government, and maybe we shouldn't have been too surprised at the reaction of the Russian people. Obviously, our first indicator was when they booed Putin at an event of martial arts and introduced him. By the way, Tip O'Neill once said, "Don't ever be introduced at a sporting event." He said, "They didn't come to see you." And he was, and I found out a couple of times he was right. So I think that the Russian people, obviously a lot of them have seen a much better life, and when we reach a certain level, they want other things. And I would be very interested to see what happens on December 24th, the next big day that they are supposedly organizing elections. Most of the, quote, Russian experts say this is a kind of a one-time deal, won't last. Those are the same experts that said the demonstrations in Tunisia wouldn't last, or Egypt, or, you know, on and on. Same experts. So So we'll see. But I think that we have to gauge our relationship with Russia on a balance that also, as we have in recent years, balance the human rights, freedom, democracy, all those kinds of aspects of Russia with it. And finally, I still continue to be, and I'll admit a great deal of bias, I continue to be outraged at the continued Russian occupation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It's disgraceful. They're even in violation of the agreement that Sarkozy brokered, and they make no bones about it. And I'm sure you may have seen the paper that they had two pro-Russian candidates in Abkhazia or South Ossetia. I think it was South Ossetia. And two candidates, both of them Russian-sponsored, but one of them that they didn't want to win won. So they immediately had convened their court and threw out the election. I mean, you can't make it up. It's just crazy stuff. So anyway, I'll never forget going into South Ossetia. This is before the Russian-Georgian conflict. We went in, and we were in about 200 yards, and here was a poster, I swear to God, almost half as big as that wall, that had a picture of Putin and said, "Vladimir Putin, our president." Wow, okay. And then we met with a bunch of Russian thugs. But anyway, so I think history's on the march. I really do. I think it's a hinge of history. I can't exaggerate what I think is happening in the world, and a little of it here in the United States. When I drive down the street in Phoenix, Arizona, where half the homes are underwater, where you go by strip mall after strip mall, it's closed, and then you read in the paper about these large financial institutions declaring billions of dollars in profits and salaries and bonuses and stock options, I'm telling you, there's a great deal of unrest out there. And there is a possibility that if not in this election, in the next election, we may see an independent candidate, and one that will draw a lot of support. In my home state of Arizona, when I first ran for Congress back during the Spanish-American War, there was a 5% Republican independent registration, 5%. Now it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, with the largest voter registration increase by far, independent voter registration. People are sick and tired.
Well, given that, this is an important point. I mean, given that there's that mood in the country, which you're more in touch with than I am, certainly, how do you tell those people that while they are hurting and while we are suffering at home, the United States needs to continue being the major global force in the world, that even though there are other rich countries, the United States should be spending $600 billion a year on its defense budget, should be spending money on foreign aid, and should be involved in the business of every place around the world? I mean, don't they want to say to you, as the President has said, it's time to start nation building at home?
Well, first of all, the last election and maybe this election will largely rest on the economy. And that, in most respects, is understandable. When we have the economic conditions that we do, then, of course, our voters' focus is going to be on the economy and jobs. And we are now seeing on both sides, but also particularly on the Republican side, a rise of isolationism. There have always been tensions in the Republican Party going back to the 1930s. That after World War II, it was the Taft-Eisenhower wings of our party. There's always been those tensions. And thanks to Ronald Reagan, that was diminished rather dramatically. I don't think I've been more appalled at any time than when the House of Representatives passed a resolution saying that we should have nothing to do whatsoever with Libya. The United States House of Representatives, with Republican votes, that we should have nothing to do with Libya, while Gaddafi's at the gates of Benghazi promising to slaughter and murder anybody who opposed him. I was really appalled by that. So it's up to us. It's up to us. And it's up to presidential leadership as well to tell the American people why we need to have a base in Okinawa, to tell the American people that we should be a part of what's going on in this Arab Spring around the world. Why it's in our tradition, it's in our history, it's in our values, it's in our Declaration of Independence. It's everything we stand for and believe in. And at the same time, I think we have to also emphasize the American people, the instability in the world today, and the threats that we face, which we all know a long list of. It requires leadership. And if I have many criticisms of the president, I will freely admit, but one of them is you should talk to the American people more about these things. You should go on television and say, here's why we have to have these bases in the Pacific. Here's how we're going to, maybe more importantly, here's how we're going to handle the Arab Spring, how we're going to help these people satisfy their ambitions and their God-given rights. You know, Americans have to be led, and I think it's more important now, given the economic situation, than perhaps that it's ever been.
You have every year traveled to Europe. You know Europe extremely well. What's your take on what's happening in Europe now? Where do you think things are likely to wind up? As sub-questions of that, what do you think about the decision of the United Kingdom to stay out of this latest agreement? Just your thoughts in general about where Europe is right now.
I think they're in a period of great flux, obviously, and they're finding out that the European Union is far from a union. When you look at a country like Germany versus a country like Greece, and the whole issue of the currency and the union itself, I think, is going to be a subject of great debate. Let me just mention the effect on defense, I think, is going to be significant. I think they're going to get out of Afghanistan, obviously following our lead, and I think that they are, when you look at the British defense budget, I mean, we thought we saw kind of the decline and end of the British Empire. Now we're really seeing a 30,000-man army. I mean, it is really draconian. And so I think what we can count on is less and less involvement with NATO in international issues such as Libya and others. I'm so grateful to the British and the French and the Qatars and the UAE and others who helped so much in Libya. I'm not sure if you're going to see that, at least from the Europeans, again. And their defense budgets are going to be at such a level that their contributions are, you know, I remember, I think it was Rasmussen, the head of NATO, that talked about, might have been his predecessor, talked about they needed 2 more helicopters from NATO in Afghanistan. There was a requirement for it. Took them 2 years and they never got it. I mean, when you look at their actual defense capabilities, they are minimal now and they're going to be less. So we just have to understand that. That's the bad news. But the good news, in my view, is you're seeing Qatar, you're seeing UAE, you're seeing other countries sort of stepping forward to fill in sort of this vacuum.
Well, you began to answer the question I was about to ask, which is, given that you feel the United States needs to continue playing a certain role in the world, for the past 60 years, the sort of shoulder-to-shoulder ally on this has been Europe. We've got other powers rising now, India and China. Russia's potentially going to become more assertive. How do we proceed without that European pillar, especially since we're not going to fill the gap that they are leaving?
Well, obviously, at the beginning of our conversation, we talked about the fact that our attention will shift where the world's economy is shifted, and that's the Asia-Pacific region. That's why, again, I applaud so much the President's statement about how we're going to be involved and engaged. This agreement with the Australians is very important. I think it's a model for other countries that become increasingly alarmed at Chinese behavior. And I think we're going to have to form new alliances. There'll never be another NATO alliance. You've got to remember that the NATO alliance was formed in the face of a direct threat of the Soviet Union takeover of Europe. But there can be a serious involvement and engagement with all these countries. And then, obviously, I don't mean that Europe sinks into irrelevancy, because the entire EU economy is still pretty significant. But I still think they're going to go through some significant challenges before they get the European economy back on track. And that's obviously the view of most experts. There's real questions now about the last agreement. You know, how many times are we going to watch the stock market go up 300 points because they reached an agreement, and the next day somebody goes down 300 points because somebody says, hey, it's a lousy agreement? Aren't we getting a little weary about that? And who's making the money? When the stock market gyrates, if anybody here knows, I'd like to hear from them. But it certainly does drive off the ordinary investor. So I don't say they're going to be irrelevant, but I say that our whole alliance with the Europeans and NATO, from a defense standpoint, is going to diminish rapidly as we move into the region. By the way, I always like to have books recommended to me, and I read Kaplan's book called Monsoon. I think it's a good read. And by the way, for a holiday reading, I recommend this new book called Jerusalem. It's a fascinating. Montier, I think.
Montefiore.
Yeah, Montefiore. It's an excellent page turner. It's intimidating because
it's an
about that thick,
page turner, right.
I guarantee and I get no commission from.
But a lot of grateful authors, that's for sure. Well, let me just ask one final question, then open it up if we have a couple minutes for a couple of questions. You know, what we're saying about Europe right now, a lot of people are also saying about the United States. I mean, if you ask around the world, I think a lot of people think the United States is on its way out. In fact, if you ask around the United States, a lot of people think that the United States is that we really can't deal with the problems that we're faced with right now, whether it's because of our political system or just the straits we've gotten ourselves into. Leave us on an optimistic note. Why do you think that we're going, aside from we're America and we can do it and that kind of stuff, but I mean, why do you think we're going to be capable of pulling ourselves out of the hole that we're in right now?
I don't know if we will be or not. There's no doubt there is a perception throughout the Arab world and the Middle East that the United States is withdrawing. I get that from every leader that I meet with, and I think it's on its face a fairly valid assumption. I guess it was a guy that used to be in the Bush administration was meeting with Zardari a couple of weeks ago, and he said to Zardari, do you think that there'll be a agreement with the Taliban? And Zardari just laughed and said, why would there be? You're leaving. I mean, that's what we hear from all over, and it's very valid, and it's terribly worrisome to me. You know, I don't mind the president meeting with Maliki, but to somehow go to Fort Bragg tomorrow and claim victory in a conflict that he opposed and said the surge could never work, and vociferously opposed it in debate with people like me on the floor, and then somehow to claim victory is a bit presumptuous in my view. I'm very worried. I'm very concerned about the United States' status in the world and our commitment to alliances and friends and democracy. And I believe that leading from behind is not the role of the United States in the world. If we lead from behind, who leads from in front? And obviously, any candidate for doing that, I'm not sure we would be comfortable with. So I don't mean to end on such a pessimistic note, but I think the world is in a state of flux that we have not seen, certainly the Arab world, since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And I'm very concerned about what role we can play. And when people say to me, and they do at town hall meetings, why don't we just withdraw? As you said, my question in response to them is, who do you want to lead then? Somebody has to. Do you want it to be somebody in the Arab world? Do you want it to be China? Do you want it to be India? And by the way, I do have high hopes for India and our relationship with India. They've got a lot of problems with corruption in India, and they're very kind of troubled democracy in some respects, but they are a democracy, and their economy is booming. And I see a much closer alliance with the United States and India in the future. Is again I don't like to use the word counterweight, but certainly a response to Chinese assertiveness there and in that part of the world. But I am worried. I wish that this debate that Republicans are having wouldn't be based on who makes the biggest mistake and who can't remember what, but more on national security issues. And there are sharp division amongst those candidates, as you know. Huntsman wants everybody out of Afghanistan immediately, and Romney is saying we need to maintain our presence there. So I'd like to see that as part of the debate, and unfortunately it's not enough. These debates, by the way, my friends, haven't been through them. They've just deteriorated into gotcha sessions, and it's unfortunate because I think that when you read of the stories of these debates, it's always who made a mistake, who was it that said the wrong thing. There's never reporting of their vision as to how we're going to face these challenges that confront us. But, you know, in the words of Chairman Mao, it's always darkest before it's totally black. And I would again like to say, I think we are challenged. I think we're having great difficulties in many parts of the world, but I still think that we are when I meet with these young Egyptians, when I'm in Tunisia, at a dinner in Tunisia, a young woman stands up and says to me, the group of the ones that led the revolution, she said, do you know who our national hero is? And I said, who? She said, Mark Zuckerberg. I'm not making that up. I'm not that. In Tunisia, Mark Zuckerberg is their national hero. They want to be like us. They want our support and our assistance. And they want, America is still, in my view, their model and their hope and their aspiration and their dream to be like us. Now, our challenge is to be worthy of it.
Okay, I knew we could end on a positive note if we waited long enough. Okay, all right. We have time for one question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So,
I'm sorry for the long answer.
No.
Can we take two real
it was a
quick?
good answer. All right, we'll take two questions. Young lady right over here.
Thank you, Leah Fan, a Chinese postgraduate, and thank you, Mr. McCain, for your wonderful comments. And just now you mentioned the Arab Spring movement, and I got two questions relating to this. The first one is you just said that the Arab Spring movement might spread to China, so could you elaborate a little bit on it? And the second question is that how did you see the development of the Occupy movement here in U.S.? Thank you.
I think the Arab Spring has already come to China, and I think that the Chinese ruling junta realizes that. It was a small demonstration of about 10 people, and there must have been 500 security forces that cracked down on them. And we see, you know, all of their manifestations of trying to suppress the internet and other social networking and in the long run, they're not going to succeed. You can't succeed any more than the Russians could prevent Lech Walesa from operating a printing press back in the days of the workers at Gdansk. I think that, and the second question was?
Occupy Wall Street.
Oh, I think that they're mistaken in their activities because they cause harm to or dislocation or difficulties for the lives of other people. In other words, Americans don't like it when they do things which don't allow us to operate freely. I have town hall meetings all the time. I love town hall meetings. They're my favorite form of communication. If they come in and deny you the ability of your fellow citizens to be able to ask you a question and have a discourse with them, then they're stifling really the rights of other citizens. So I'm not a fan of them, and I think it's wrong of them to disrupt the lives of our fellow citizens. But again, I think that there is a frustration level out there that is almost unprecedented, that you'd probably have to go back to the Vietnam War before you would find a level of discontent as we see in America today, for different reasons, but that level.
We have one more question. Is there a microphone over here? Anybody have a mic? Sorry to make you run all the way over there. This gentleman right here.
Hi, Danny Cruz, GWAT Solutions. Given that the pundits and experts were caught by surprise on Tunisia and Egypt, and given the history of what's happening in Russia, and the fact that we had a chance in the 1990s, when the collapse of the Soviet Union, to do something about the building of democracy, rule of law, etc. If you were around at that time, Senator, in the 90s, when the Clinton experts were all some of the first people to rush in to advise the Russian government. We had even experts from Harvard, and we had a whole bunch of modern-day equivalent of carpetbaggers. We don't know when Putin's going to go, but let's say he goes anywhere in the next 3 to 12 months. There's going to be a lot of unrest and uncertainty in Russia. What can the U.S. and what can the leadership do to prepare for that, given this will be our second chance?
On the lines of the Arab Spring, could I mention that I think one of the historic mistakes that been made of the Obama presidency was when they were demonstrating in the streets of Tehran, chanting, "Obama, Obama, are you with us or are you with them?" And he came out and said, "I don't want to jeopardize my chances to negotiate with the Islamic Republic of Iran." That, to me, was one of the huge historic mistakes, and I think we've been paying for it ever since. I agree with you. I think we can look back as the success of the former Iron Curtain countries as something that we should be proud of. I think that we should learn the lesson of what we tried to do in Russia and not make that mistake again in these countries like Tunisia, Morocco, etc. I think that we went into Russia and sort of kind of dictated immediate change to them. You've got to do this, you've got to do that, and you know, without realizing that it was a very difficult task, and we were kind of telling them what to do. This time, why don't we assist these Arab countries, tell them how you build democracy, how you conduct an election, how you vote, register voters, etc., rather than take each one of these countries. One of the biggest mistakes we make is lumping them all together as being the same. Tunisia is not the same as Yemen. Morocco is not the same as Egypt. And so I think we've got to stand by and be ready to assist, especially economically. If we can, I think the future of Egypt is to a large degree rests on whether their economy will improve or not. I was at a dinner in, I think it was Tunisia, and again, one of the young women activists said to me, "Senator McCain, it's not the first election we worry about, it's the second." And obviously, the point is that unless, especially Egypt, gets some economic growth, get some of these people jobs and improve their economy, then it will probably increase the chances of failure. So I think we underestimated the enormity of the challenge in Russia at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, and I think we made a whole series of mistakes, and we should look back at those mistakes and vow not to repeat them. And one of them is let them find their own way. Don't dictate them to all of a sudden be like Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I mean, they're not. And that's why I'm not as alarmed about the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood or Islamic governments in these countries. If they're moderate, it's fine with me. And the best way to make sure they're moderate, obviously, is to have a satisfied citizenry. But you really raise a very, very valid point. But I would also say again, they do want our assistance. They want our investment. They want a lot of things that we have, and I hope that we will be forthcoming, because failure, obviously, then the consequences, I don't have to describe to you the effects that will have on threats to the United States of America. Can I say that this organization, the Foreign Policy Initiative, I like to come every year. I'm a great admirer of Bob Kagan. I'm a greater admirer of Fred Kagan than Bob. But
so it's very smart on your part. That's a good decision.
And I really enjoy our interface, and these are most challenging times, and I appreciate everyone here's involvement in trying to address these important issues that affect the future of my constituents in the great state of Arizona. Temperature in Scottsdale today is 75. Please come and visit us at some time this winter. We take all plastic. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you.